Cedric Adams, the voice of WCCO, your good neighbor of the Northwest, 8:30 on your radio dial. It's the top of the hour and time for your weather and news update. Well, looks to be a gloomy today in the Twin Cities with intermittent light rain, high temperatures in the middle 50s. About right for the first weekend in May, I'd say, and certainly an improvement over the snow we had last weekend. Let's see, now for the morning headlines. In national news, John Gilbert Graham, 24, has been convicted of first-degree murder for stuffing a 25-stick dynamite bomb in his mother's luggage before she booked a United Airlines flight at Denver. Shortly after takeoff, the plane exploded, killing all 44 passengers. The jury has sentenced Graham to the gas chamber. In Seat Pleasant, Maryland, we find that Billy Crevitt, a 14-year-old junior high school student, burst into a crowded classroom and opened fire with a .22 caliber rifle, killing one teacher and seriously wounding 2 others before being overpowered. The sullen and defiant teenage student said his only regret was he didn't kill the principal. In world news, it was reported that on Runnet Island, one of the docks that made up the Intu Atoll, a baby atomic bomb was exploded yesterday. Federal authorities state it was a test of a warhead to be used on a tactical missile with a force of 15,000 tons of TNT. It is further reported that next Tuesday, the first test of an airdrop hydrogen bomb will be conducted. These explosions are part of a current test series that will include 10 nuclear devices. Turning back to local news, Hennepin County law officers have charged 45 youths with possessions of beer after stopping 100 cars in Minnetonka Township roadblock. Under Sheriff Jack Whitney reported that this is part of an all-out attack on teenage drinking. As an aftermath of the roadblock, Hopkins police reported about a dozen teenagers were dispersed in front of Matt's Cafe after complaints of rowdyism. Now, on a more positive note, for the last 10 days, the 766 delegates of the Methodist General Conference have been meeting here at the Minneapolis Municipal Auditorium. Earlier this week, they agreed on a history-making move by voting to submit an amendment to their church's annual conferences. If adopted, the amendment would permit individual black churches to transfer out of the central jurisdiction and into the regular geographical annual conferences. This transfer would require a 2/3 vote of all conferences in the jurisdiction involved. Once all the churches had left, the black grouping would be abolished. It's anticipated that the abolition of the grouping will take many years. At today's session, the Methodists are set to vote on granting full clergy rights to its women ministers. Given the historic nature of this action, WCCO will be providing live radio coverage of the floor debate. We take you now to our mobile radio broadcasting unit inside the Municipal Auditorium and our religion correspondent, Roger Smith. Take it away, Roger.
Thank you, Cedric. I'm here sitting under the huge arched skylights of the Minneapolis Auditorium, where the delegates from the Methodist General Conference have gathered. Even on this gray May day, the skylight is helping to illuminate this gathering as the delegates deliberate on the serious issues before them. On my right, at the west end of the auditorium, there's a stage with a podium where the bishops and their staff are seated. In front, there are seats for the nearly 800 people who will be voting on the various reports and amendments. Among the seats are 4 strategically placed microphones so that voices from the floor can be heard by everyone in the hall. In the gallery seats that extend from the floor up to the ceiling, there's also a scattering of interested, non-voting observers. By auditorium standards, this is a small crowd. In fact, soon after the Methodists vacate the premises, the auditorium will be transferred to host Elvis Presley, who will bring his bump and grind routine to what is expected to be a sold-out crowd of 12,000. But Elvis Elvis is not our concern today. We're here to hear the floor debate on what is one of the more controversial issues before this gathering. Whether to give women ministers in their church full clergy rights. Here to help me bring in to you the ins and outs of the proceedings is one of the leaders in this fight, Dr. Georgia Harkness, Professor of Applied Theology at the Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. Good morning, Dr. Harkness.
Good morning, Roger, and thank you for having me. First, now, I would be doing a disservice if I did not recognize Mrs. Frank Brooks, President of the Women's Division of Christian Service, and Mrs. Arthur Young, Dean of WDCS Training Institutes. Without their dedicated work over many years, I doubt that we'd be witnessing today what could be an historic event.
Yes, Dr. Harkness. I understand it's been a long and difficult road for those seeking full-fledged voting rights for women Methodist ministers. Why don't you give this listening audience a bit of background on that journey?
Oh, gladly, Roger. Now, for Methodists, the journey really started shortly before the Civil War. Women like Phoebe Palmer and Catherine Booth arose as leaders in the movement to expand the role of women in ministry. It is not coincidence that their actions parallel the rise of women leaders in the missionary, temperance, suffrage, and anti-slavery movements. After the Civil War, talented Methodist women began to seek licenses to preach from their local congregations, since there seemed to be nothing in the discipline that would explicitly prevent them. The first was Maggie Van Cott, who began preaching in 1869 in Ellenville, New York, and later she traveled as an evangelist, encouraging other women who felt the call to preach God's word to do so as well.
I had no idea. And how did this sit with the Methodist men of the day?
Well, Roger, I think for the most part, women preaching was tolerated as a novelty, although many were converted to the idea by the obvious abilities of these women to bring people to the realization of their need for Christ's salvation.
So what happened next?
Well, the whole issue was brought to a head when Anne Howard Shaw and Anna Oliver were recommended for ordination by the New England Annual Conference in 1880. The presiding bishop in New England ruled against it. So, the conference appealed the ruling to the General Conference, which responded by affirming the bishop's decision, specifically banning the licensing or ordination of women and rescinding any licenses already granted to women.
And that was that, I guess.
Well, yes and no. True, it was Methodism's loss, and many talented women left our ranks, but other Methodist women found ways to serve the church as leaders in the Women's Foreign Missionary Society and the Deaconess movement. And it should be remembered that the women's issue, so-called, did not go away after that 1880 decision. Memorials were brought each quadrennial gathering. Indeed, at the following General Conference in 1884, a resolution to allow for the licensing of women failed by a vote of 126 ayes versus 222 nays. So you see, even among these old-time male Methodist preachers, a sizable minority wished to expand the ministry of women.
Yet, as I remember, the right to be licensed to preach was not guaranteed to women until the 1920 General Conference. I mean, that's 40 years of waiting for the forces seeking change. Those wanting to keep the status quo seem to hold all the cards.
Oh, indeed they did. For example, perhaps the leading conservative in this debate was James M. Buckley, who was the editor of the largest Methodist publication, The Christian Advocate. In its pages, he argued passionately against not only the participation of women in the ministry, but also against women as lay delegates to General Conference, which he was able to delay until 1904.
Well, those seeking ecclesiastical suffrage for women certainly had a steep hill to climb. Yet here we are today on the cusp of achieving that goal. Please tell me, how were these seemingly insurmountable barriers crossed? And who, well, beside yourself, of course, were the standard bearers for reform?
Oh, Roger, as I look back, I hope our listeners can appreciate how slow and incremental change has been. Since 1880, many women and some men have fought hard for ecclesiastical equality in the Methodist Church. But at every corner, there has been fierce resistance. Each battle fell short of its goal, and compromise just had to be accepted. Perhaps the leading warrior for women's ministerial rights leading up to the General Conference of 1920 was, M. Madeline Southard.
Oh, yes, the founder of International Association of Women Ministers. A wonderful organization that mentors women pastors of all denominations. I had no idea that she was involved in this fight. Is she still alive?
Oh, indeed, Roger. She's not active, though. She's retired to a Methodist retirement home in Topeka, Kansas, and she still follows the work of the IAWM closely and has urged them to do all they can to support granting full clergy rights at this conference.
And what was her role in the 1920 conference?
Well, Roger, she was a special soul. Born into a hardscrabble life in Kansas, she worked hard to educate herself, graduating from Southwestern College in Winfield, Kansas, and Garrett Biblical School. However, it was her work with the young military recruits at Great Lake Naval Training Station during World War I that convinced her of the need for women in the ministry. She concluded that the male autocracy who ran the churches and who opposed female equality on their ancient prejudices, centering around the words of St. Paul, were on the wrong side of history. So as a lay delegate from Southwestern Kansas Conference, she drafted a memorial calling for full clergy rights for Methodist women, and she brought it to the General Conference in 1920 in Des Moines, Iowa.
Just like that?
Well, no. The truth is, she had recently published an article in the Methodist Review based on her master's thesis, and it was entitled Jesus' Attitude Toward Women, which had brought her some notoriety. So she was suggested by others as the appropriate person to make the presentation. And she had done her homework. After drafting the petition, she first had it refined by an editor, and then sent it out to 4 theological schools and 4 annual conferences seeking endorsements ahead of time.
And how was her memorial received by this 1920 General Conference?
Well, according to the Christian Advocate, her plea caused quite a stir among the delegates. They reported that her looks, her attire, her subject, and appealing note in her voice combined to give her a strong hold on her hearers. However, as persuasive as she might have been, conservative forces were ready and rallied in a procedural move to delay the vote. They were able to have her memorial referred to a committee. When that committee reported back 4 days later, they recommended that women be allowed to be licensed as local pastors, but that ordination and admission to conference be referred to a commission that would report at the next General Conference. Madeline had to settle for this small step forward.
Well, surely momentum was on her side. I mean, Madeline must have been certain that the next General Conference in 1924 would bring her cause success.
Well, that's what she thought. But the special commission worked in secret. No one knew the contents of their report until they were presented on the floor of the 1924 conference. To Madeline, the document was surprisingly negative. Now, it's true, the ordination of women was recommended, but only locally. more important, conference membership for women was denied.
Ooh.
As one, its supporters said, the glory of motherhood can never be outdazzled by the mere privilege of belonging to annual. Now, Madeline was able to delay the vote, but when on the next day she brought forward an amendment that would give full clergy rights to women, only 50 of the 850 delegates voted in favor.
Ooh.
While the amendment failed with the granting of ordination rights, women had taken another step forward. As an aside, Roger, you might be interested to know that was the first time the proceedings of General Conference were broadcast on radio.
Really? And here we're doing the same today. So I know the listeners are curious whether Madeline carried on the fight to the next General Conference.
Well, you know, Roger, with the victory for ordination rights, Madeline's desire to battle the Methodist Church was beginning to wane. Nearing 50 years of age, she turned her attention to missionary work. She wrote books, and she worked with the International Association for Women Ministers. At the next General Conference in 1928, a resolution for full clergy rights for women lost by a 2-to-1 margin. So, Roger, that's when I decided it was time for me to help lead the struggle for equal ecclesiastical rights.
I see. And what was your approach after seeing Madeline struggle so hard and made only incremental gains?
Well, it was obvious to me that male-dominated structures, such as the Methodist Church, do not respond well to strident advocacy or shaking of one's fist. Instead, I became a kind of circuit rider for women's equality within our church. I traveled throughout our land and overseas and wherever I was invited to speak on the issue. And let me assure you, I was not alone. Other women joined me. In particular, I'd like to lift up the name Florence Resor Jardine.
I don't believe I'm familiar with her.
Well, you should be, as should our Minnesota listeners. After all, she was the first ordained local preacher in Minnesota and pastored churches in Oregon and Iowa as well. Like Madeline Southard, Florence was president of the International Association of Women Preachers and editor of their newsletter, The Women's Pulpit. At the 1939 Uniting Conference, she argued passionately for full clergy rights for women preachers in what would be the newly formed Methodist Church. She reported the Minority Report on Clergy Rights for Women to conference and argued that clergy rights for women were consistent with the teachings of Jesus Christ. She noted that although the Methodist Episcopal Church South allowed neither the licensure nor ordination of women, the Methodist Protestant Church allowed for full clergy rights. So why not make this one distinctive feature of their denomination an integral part of the merged body? Florence also pleaded with the delegates to not be fearful and to have more faith in the wonderful machinery of their church to adapt to the cause of righteousness and justice.
And what was the counter-argument on the floor of the conference?
Delegate Isaac Miller summed up the opposition's core position by saying, "It simply will not work."
And how did the conference respond?
Well, those opposed to Florence's Minority Report for full clergy rights were able to limit the debate, but still, when they called for a show of hands, the presiding bishop thought that the substitute report had been accepted.
Really?
Yes. But Florence and her supporters' jubilation was short-lived, for when the secretaries took a standing count, her substitute report fell short by just 13 votes out of a total of 755 delegates present.
How disappointing for her. So I guess the majority's view that ministry is a man's job prevailed.
Yes, it did, Roger. Right up to this day, there is a stubborn faction that maintains that granting full clergy rights for women would break up the finest fraternity on the face of the earth. Some even cynically propose the formation of a feminine conference for those churches that desire women preachers. But since 1939, women have continued to lobby for inclusion, particularly through the work of the Women's Society of Christian Service. Each General Conference, memorials were brought forward, even though it was clear that a majority of the delegates were tired of dealing with that issue and wished it would just go away.
Yes, and that reminds me of my reporting to the 1952 General Conference in San Francisco. As I remember, James Chubb was the one who brought the obligatory minority report to the conference floor. As was the pattern since 1939, the woman's issue was scheduled at the very end of the conference, after the delegates had spent many grueling hours debating other issues, including a plan for major governmental reorganization of the church, voting to rebuke the Methodist Federation for Social Action as too West Wing, and they also endured the convoluted parliamentary maneuvers that gave the conservative faction an upset victory and perceived the clause requiring ministerial candidates to swear to abstain from smoking. Despite Jim Chubb's pleas to give equality to women, debate was limited to one speaker on each side, and the forces that maintained that admission of women to conference was just not workable. That won out on a simple show of hands. 4 years later, here we are again. And I see that Jim Chubb is again down on the floor, approaching a microphone, about to address the conference.
Yes, and Bishop Harrell is calling everyone to take their seats. Let's listen in.
Bishop, members of the conference, my name is James S. Chubb, ministerial delegate from Nebraska Conference and chair of the Standing Committee on Ministry. The Committee on Ministry recommends the changing of paragraph 313 in our discipline. Currently, paragraph 313 reads, "Women are included in the foregoing provisions except insofar as they apply to candidates for the traveling ministry." Thus, they are denied membership in an annual conference. Our committee recommends that the paragraph 313 be changed so it reads as follows. "Women are included in all provisions except that only unmarried women and widowers may apply as candidates to the traveling ministry or continue therein." I want all of the conference to know that this amendment was approved by our subcommittee by unanimous consent. And let me tell you how we arrived at our decision. As you know, we received more than 2,000 petitions urging the granting of full clergy rights for women. And after carefully reviewing these petitions, our subcommittee agreed that we would take a straw vote by secret ballot. And the result was that we had 7 on one side and 7 on the other. And after we had worked through this carefully, we recognized that we were up against 2 decisions. One, is the matter of full clergy rights for women a matter of principle? And I think all of us were persuaded that in principle, we could not object to it. Then we faced the other question. What are the difficulties, the practical difficulties in the way this is going to be implemented at a local church level? So we turned to our district superintendents. They presented very carefully, very persuasively some of the problems, the practical problems involved in appointing female pastors to local congregations. So it seemed to us that we were moving toward a proposal which would, we realize, still be discrimination, would still be a compromise, but nevertheless, which might be the most effective step which can be taken at this time. So after hours of consideration, this subcommittee, which earlier in its deliberations had been divided on the more clear-cut issue, 7-7, now unanimously approved what you have before you.
Oh, well, Dr. Harkness, again it appears that the conference will be happy with a small step forward by only granting conference membership to single women and widows.
It does appear that's the most we can hope for. Oh, but now I see Reverend Dr. J. Dewey Muir approaching the microphone to give the minority report.
Fellow members, my name is Dewey Muir from the Illinois Conference, a ministerial delegate. First of all, I would call attention of the conference to the fact that the general vote of the Standing Committee on Ministry was 40 to 32. This hardly indicates an unanimity of opinion about allowing full clergy rights to unmarried women and widows. Our recommendation is that this general conference retains its present policy concerning candidates for the traveling ministry. We share in the noble sentiment that basically no privilege should be granted one sex which is denied to the other. However, we face the realistic problems of administration. Indeed, the proposed legislation in the majority report is an admission of the administrative problems involved. We remind you that our traveling ministry operates within an appointive system. Pastors are appointed to local churches. Churches are expected to accept the pastors appointed to them. So let's be practical. Until those demanding such legislation are committed, not only to the legislation, but to the receiving of female traveling preachers as pastors of their own churches, we are of the opinion that our present policy is best for our particular church. I trust that this general conference, not only out of any spirit of division, but out of any spirit of ill will, but only with a sense of the importance of the practical problems of administration, will not change our current system. Thank you for your consideration.
Well, Dr. Harkness, there you have it. The two positions have been stated. What comes next?
Okay, Roger, what happens now is the process of what is called perfecting the majority report. Any delegate can present amendments with the intention of improving the original report. Oh, there I see someone approaching the microphone.
Yes, my name is Leonard Schultz, Delegate, Ohio Conference. I rise to make a substitute motion. I move that the discipline be amended to read as follows, quote, "Women are eligible for all orders of the ministry and full conference membership, provided, however, that women may be left without appointments and with the approval of the annual conference, thereby located whenever the bishop and the cabinet are satisfied that all reasonable efforts have been made and no suitable appointment for her can be found. Her status and pension rights shall then be the same as those of the minister who have located at his own request." Unquote.
What's this then?
Well, Roger, it's another attempted compromise. The proposal is that women should be members of conference, but would not grant them equality with male ministers, because every male minister is guaranteed an appointment at a church, while women would not have that guarantee.
I guess it's as close to equality as you can get without getting there. It does remove the arbitrary assumption that marriage makes one unsuited for pastoral work.
Yes, the majority report assumes that there's a problem with a female pastor raising a family, so only single women are allowed. Unanswered is why the General Conference would want middle-aged married women who are done raising children to be unacceptable as members of conference.
Yet the amendment is not equality. No man would accept such a rule. And it does throw the solution to what could be ticklish and difficult problems back into the lap of the cabinet. I could definitely see this rule emboldening churches to close their doors and refuse to receive women
You're
pastors.
probably right, Roger. Oh, here I see Reverend Lambden approaching the microphone. He's a bit of an iconoclast. I'm sure he'll have something interesting to say on this issue. Let's listen.
Okay.
I'm Henry Lyle Lambden, Newark Conference. A great question can be discussed on any one of several different levels. The discussion of this question tends to drift always to the administrative level. The arguments seem to center around the perplexity of the district superintendent who's trying to promote the Reverend Jane Doe, let's say, from hard scrabble circuit to the First Church of Lickskillet. Pity the poor district superintendent is the sum and substance of the argument. After a district superintendent has had his first round with pastoral relations committees, he should have developed an epidermis that is tough enough to move a rhinoceros to envy. I don't pity the district superintendents because these men are a sturdy breed. There is another level at which the whole question needs to be considered. Is this conference prepared to say in the year of our Lord, 1956, that no woman, however well qualified educationally, whatever demonstration she has given of gifts and grace and loveliness, that no woman shall be called of God to spiritual leadership within the annual conference? Now that, my friends, is the issue. Whether any female, no matter what her qualifications, make the qualifications as exacting as you may, no female shall be called to spiritual leadership within the organizational structure of the Methodist Church we call the annual conference.
Well, that seems to get to the heart of the issue, doesn't it?
Indeed, Roger. Now, I see the bishop is calling the question on Leonard Slutz's amendment, granting conference membership for women, but not the guarantee of an appointment. Okay, by a show of hands, it seems the majority has agreed with Reverend Lambden, and the amendment has failed.
So, we're back to the original majority report. No single women in the conference. But wait, who's that approaching the microphone now, Dr. Harkness?
That is the Reverend Anderson Davis. This is interesting. Reverend Davis is from the central jurisdiction, the African American jurisdiction that earlier this week, this conference voted to begin phasing out. Let's listen to what he proposes.
Mr. Chairman, members of the conference, I'm of the opinion that if we should pass the majority report, we would still be discriminating against a large group of our women. In our own annual conference, in our own annual conference, of the 5 women who are serving as preachers, 4 of them are married women. These 4 married women have no children or home responsibility. Women who go into the field of medicine, into the field of law, and similar fields do not create a problem. I do not feel that they would create a problem in the ministry. I feel that they would bring much dignity and add much to it. The district superintendents and the bishop have great problems at times placing our men who are in the ministry. And I am sure they would not have any more trouble placing the women. Therefore, Mr. President, I move that the majority report be amended by deleting the words that only unmarried women and widowers may apply. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Harkness, Reverend Davis seems to have put full equality for women right there in front of the conference. Was this expected?
Not by me, but I welcome the effort. Oh, okay, wait. Now, here is Ashoki Singh, principal of Collins Institute in Bengal, India. It's very unusual to have a speaker from an overseas conference address the conference. So let's listen to what he has to say.
We, from the far-flung ends of the world, look up to America for inspiration and guidance in matters of progress and forward movement. So I am a bit amused at myself by the fact that I should come back from the backwoods of Bengal to champion the full clergy rights for women. It seems to me that the sentiments displayed by some of the men of this conference can be observed in our country also. Some 50 years ago, there goes a story. A friend went to a village on a hunting expedition, and there by the side of a river stood a master boatman. And he asked him, "Do the crocodiles in the river cause any harm to human life?" And the master boatman smiled and casually replied, "No harm to human life. They do occasionally carry away goats and women." Mr. Chairman, I think we can trace this hurtful sentiment back to some of the leading men of England. For instance, Samuel Johnson, the famous English writer, when told that a certain woman preached remarkably, is said to have replied, "It may indeed be remarkable preaching, sir, but it is not natural. Like a dog walking on its hind legs, you do not ask whether it is well done, but you are surprised that it is done at all." I, for one, support full clergy rights for women.
Well, that got a big laugh from the delegates and relieved some of the tension. I wonder if it will transfer to votes for the amendment. Wait now. Here's Jim Chubb approaching the microphone. I wonder what he has to add.
Mr. President, I move that we amend the proposed amendment to read, "Women are included in all provisions except that married women can only be so included by a 3/4 vote of the annual conference." I hope that we will not merely extend this right to unmarried women, but that we will extend it under this safeguard of a 3/4 vote to the married women of Methodism as well.
Wait, Dr. Harkness, can Reverend Chubb do that? An amendment to an amendment?
You know, I see the bishop is confused as well, but I'm sure the parliamentarian will straighten it out because, yes, this is allowed. And Roger, what Reverend Chubb has done is further compromise the majority report by conditionally including married women in conference membership. I believe this pushes the uncompromised granting of full clergy rights for women as close to the edge of the cliff as possible without going over.
And the debate goes on. It seems most are speaking in opposition to the amendment, including the presenter of the minority report, Reverend Murray. It's interesting that when he made the claim that there are dozens of categories, such as deaconess, set up in the discipline where no man may invade, the delegates greeted his remarks with considerable applause.
Yes, I'm not surprised. And that doesn't bode well for the final disposition of this issue, but I do see that the bishop has finally called off the debate and is calling the question.
Okay, let's see where we are. By a show of hands, Reverend Chubb's amendment requiring 3/4 vote for married women membership has failed. Now, for Reverend Davis's amendment, which would result in full clergy rights for all women.
That fails too, by a show of hands.
I'm a bit confused, Dr. Harkness. Where are we now?
Well, it would seem that the majority report has been perfected. That is, the delegates have been given a chance to make any wanted changes. However, all amendments have been turned away, and the report will remain as it was brought to the conference. Now, it's time to perfect the minority report, which would retain the status quo.
I see that Reverend Murr is ready to speak in defense. Reverend Chubb is ready to speak in opposition. But here are some women coming to the microphone. Dr. Harkness, can you tell our listeners who they are?
Oh, yes, Roger. There's Mrs. Henry Ebner, the first woman to address the conference on this issue. She's well known for opposing full clergy rights for women, mostly on the grounds that this will greatly reduce the ability to attract talented women into the missionary and deaconess fields. But I also see Mary Lou Barnwell, Executive Secretary of the Commission on Deaconess Work. I know what she will say. She took a poll of the 500 currently active deaconesses, and all except 29 favored full clergy rights for women. Even fewer have any interest in considering assuming such a relationship. So as far as Ms. Barnwell is concerned, the extension of full clergy rights to women will not affect the recruitment of deaconesses. And last, I see my close colleague, Mrs. Edwin S. Anderson. Let's listen to what she has to say.
Okay.
Bishop, my name is Mrs. Edwin S. Anderson, delegate from the New England Conference. I'm currently the president of the Conference for Women's Society of Christian Service. In considering the place of women in the church, since the early days, they were not even permitted to sit in the pew with the men of their family. To say nothing of having a voice in the church policy. To the turn of the century, when they were gradually given a bit of recognition. The present time finds women being given more recognition in all areas of service and meeting the same standards as men. We are far short in the number of ministers needed to adequately serve the churches and expand our church programs, while the reserve of well-trained women ministers is being ignored. They are permitted to perform all the services that male ministers perform, and they are required to attend the sessions of annual conference. Each woman minister brings her lay delegate. The lay delegate is permitted to sit in the bar of the conference and has both full voting rights and the privilege of the floor. But the female minister has no such privileges. She can neither speak nor vote. Some say that the churches will not accept a female minister, but we know that some conferences are already using female ministers most satisfactorily. The main conference has a Mrs. Margaret Hendrickson, who started out with 2 small churches and is now serving 5 additional churches that had no pastor. And when she gained notoriety and was featured in an issue of Life magazine, we were all too quick to claim her as a Methodist. As far as I'm concerned, there is the proof that a woman joining a conference understands the difficulties which might be encountered. And I feel these difficulties would in some way be satisfactorily solved.
Well, finally the women have had their chance to speak. What's next?
Well, it's time for Dr. Muir and Dr. Chubb to give their final statements at the podium.
In presenting the minority report, the group doing so has brought the report without any thought of malice, without any urge of contention, without any thought of anything, other than in our judgment, it is the best interest of our Methodist Church that we continue to operate as we now operate. We do not have in our minds any thought of discrimination. The last hours of debate have convinced me that there are certain administrative problems with full clergy rights that at this time cannot be resolved.
Mr. Chairman, members of the conference, I don't know. I find myself particularly proud of our Methodist women. I think they are about as capable, about as good-looking as any crowd of women I want to meet anywhere. I don't know how the women are in your family, but I found in my family the one thing that women want and they don't get is the very thing that makes them very unhappy. That tripped me up until I finally got smart and just gave it to them. The one thing that many Methodist women want, perhaps an overwhelming majority of them, is the privilege, if they qualify, to become full clergy members of the conference. We have been saying for several quadrennia now, someday we will do it. The time has come to do it now. Let us get on with the voting.
I see the bishop has called the question of the minority report, which would keep the status quo.
And it appears that the vote has failed by a show of hands. Oh, wait. There's a motion that a standing vote be taken that can be demanded if a third of the delegates agree to it, and it appears that that's what will happen.
Indeed, the secretary's taking a standing count. And here's his announcement. In favor of the minority report, 310. And against, 425. So it fails. 42% versus 58%.
And here is Reverend Muir again, and what has he to say about that, I wonder?
Well, Mr. Chairman, may I express to you my very great appreciation for the fine way in which you addressed the minority report this morning. I am quite convinced of this one thing, that Methodists may not, and indeed ought not, always to agree with each other in all matters. But in this we really ought always to agree, that when we disagree agreeably. I also want to clearly state to this body my position. Since the minority report has not been accepted by the conference, I am now swinging my full support to the majority report and trust that without a great deal of further debate or deliberation, you will enact it as the legislation of this General Conference. Thank you.
What's this then? The leading voice of those opposed to full clergy rights for women is declaring his full support for the original compromise report and urging its immediate passage.
Yeah, Roger, Reverend Muir is hoping to limit the breadth of his defeat by allowing only unmarried women to serve as full members of conference. From his point of view, a wise tactic. Oh, but wait, here's Mr. Slutz again. Remember, he started the debate by offering an amendment allowing the cabinet to locate a woman if a church could not be found. I wonder what he has to say.
Mr. Chairman, Larry Slutz, I move that we delete all of paragraph 313, which bars women from conference membership, and insert a new paragraph to read, any annual conference may include women in the provisions of their discipline which apply to the traveling ministry, and may establish limitations for the inclusion of women in such provisions.
Dr. Harkness, I'm confused. Is this an amendment to the majority report?
Well, it's a substitute amendment, and it will replace the majority report. What Mr. Slutz is doing here is admitting that some annual conferences are more ready to accept women as members than others. I suppose it's the old states' rights argument that some have so often raised in the past.
All right. I see the bishop has called the question quickly, and it's failed by a show of hands. Here's Mr. Schultz once again, Mr. Schlutz once again.
Mr. Chairman,
Let's listen.
I bring a substitute motion. I move that the phrase, Women are included in the foregoing provisions, except insofar as they apply to the candidates for the traveling ministry, be entirely deleted from the Methodist discipline.
What's this, Dr. Harkness?
Well, it would appear that Dr. Slutz, or Mr. Slutz, excuse me, is bringing us back to what Reverend Davis proposed back at the beginning of the debate, to simply grant full clergy membership to women. It appears that Mr. Slutz is challenging the conference to drop its cautiousness on this question and let every man or woman who comes in front of an annual conference for admission to be judged on qualification alone. Amen to that, I say.
Well, I didn't see that coming. It would seem that the forces for change are making their big play. Oh, but wait. Here's Dr. Chubb broaching a microphone. I wonder what this is about.
Mr. Chairman, while I agree in principle to what Mr. Slutz is bringing forth, I do believe he wants us to slip out the side door and leave the matter alone. I think we should meet this issue squarely, and I would like to offer an amendment to the substitute so that paragraph 313 would read, women are included in the foregoing provisions and may apply as candidates for the traveling ministry as provided for in chapter 3 of the Book of Discipline.
Well, Dr. Harkness, is this putting a spanner in the works? Both the substitute and the proposed amendment, they accomplish the same thing, but by a different manner.
Yes, it's confusing. It's confusing. And it's clear there's confusion on the floor as well, which the bishop is trying to straighten out. I see the delegates are asking the secretary to read the amendment for the third time. It seems the delegates have the same question. Would both the substitute and the amendment result in full clergy rights for women? The bishop has now reassured the delegates that this is indeed his understanding, and he's now calling the vote on the amendment to the substitute.
Okay. From the standing count, it appears Dr. Chubb's amendment to the substitute, which modifies paragraph 313 to include women in the traveling ministry, has passed. But here's the official tally. It's 389 for and 297 against. Well, there you are. Full clergy rights for women.
Not quite. What the conference did was to approve the amendment and the substitute and make them the majority report. They will have to vote to adopt the majority report. And Roger, there's a motion to adjourn.
A last-ditch delaying tactic, I suppose, by those in the opposition. But wait! The bishop has quickly called for a show of hands to adjourn, and it's failed. He's now calling the whole question of adoption of the majority report and thus the granting of full clergy rights for women by the Methodist Church. I see the bishop is surveying the raised hands of the delegates before him. Seems to be taking his time. I do wonder if he's perhaps reflecting on the 75 years since the 1880 General Conference slammed the door on Anne Howard Shaw and Anna Oliver, and the struggle and sacrifice of so many Methodists to reach this critical moment. There. The bishop has completed his count and he has gavelled the adoption of the majority report. Dr. Harkness, can you believe it? The conference has adopted the new majority report. And so it's finally done. Delegates have risen to their feet. Listen to the applause. And look, Dr. Harkness, the bishop is looking this way and calling you to the podium. You should make your way down there. And as you do, I see Mrs. Margaret Henderson sitting nearby. Some of our listeners will remember the wonderful feature she had in Life magazine a few years back on her ministry to 7 rural churches in Maine, which she served as an ordained supply pastor. Let's see if we can get her to join us for a comment on today's proceedings. Reverend Hendrickson, this is Roger Schmidt of WCCO Radio. Would you care to give your listeners your reaction on this historic occasion?
Certainly, Roger. As a visitor to General Conference, let me say how deeply I appreciate the friendly welcome given to me during the conference by pastors and laymen alike. I think it's important that women should resolve now to be ministers in every fine and highest sense of the word. We should conduct ourselves with the modesty and quiet dignity in the conference so that our brothers will be glad that they have enacted this legislation. Let there be no petticoat privileges, but let us be equally ready to carry our share of the conference responsibility. I have no doubt that women will be able to walk worthy of this high calling.
Thank you. I see now that Dr. Chubb is introducing Dr. Harkness to the conference. Let's see what he has to say.
Mr. Chairman, this is a day of particular triumph and significance to one of the members of this group who for many years has been looking forward to this moment when full clergy rights for women will be voted on by this General Conference. I refer to Dr. Georgia Harkness. I think that it is a matter only to her as a courtesy from the General Conference to express the appreciation of the conference for this valiant fight she has waged for this cause for many years, and express to her how we know that on this day she must have a peculiar satisfaction in the knowledge that this fight has eventuated in final victory for the cause. Let us salute Dr. Georgia Harkness.
Listen to the applause now. The whole auditorium is standing and applauding. And now Dr. Harkness is coming to the microphone.
Well, I must have a moment to thank you for this very wonderful expression. Some of you have wondered why I didn't speak this afternoon. It says in the Bible that there is a time to speak and a time to be silent. I thought we would do better if we let the rest of you speak. Thank you so much.
And now on this high note, I'm going to thank Reverend Hendrickson for joining me and also send a big thank you to Dr. Harkness for all her help in explaining this historical debate to our listeners. Now I'm going to send us back to the WCCO studios in downtown Minneapolis. Take it away, Cedric.